If you are a singer, you probably sing with something like a choir, maybe you do musical theater, maybe you're just working with a voice teacher. But I'm going to bet that at least at some point in time, somebody in charge has said to you, you need to mark your music. Do you know what they mean? So sometimes they're really good about saying, hey, why don't you specifically do X, Y, and Z to mark your music to make sure that you remember things? It's important to write things in your music because our brains can only remember so many things. And when we're singing, we're worried about our breath, we're worried about our tone, we're worried about maybe remembering something else entirely. And a lot of times, some of these little notes that we end up marking end up going right out the window. So what we can do is mark our music so we remember. However, there's kind of some tricks that you can do to mark your music better to make it easier for you. So this video is going to talk a little bit about how you can mark your music, and then also like different things you can do whether you can or cannot read music. This is for anybody who just happens to have a sheet of music in front of them while they're trying to learn a song or perform a song. Doesn't matter whether you can read every note on that page. Okay, so what I have here, I'm going to actually look at two different songs here. We're going to start with a classical piece that, as you can see here by the top line, we are not singing in English. And so we're just going to assume that we are going to sing the Italian line. Now, some of you might have already sung in Italian a whole bunch of times, and you can look at that and say, I can pronounce all of that. And that's really cool. But if you can't, and that's like the majority of my students, oftentimes we need a little bit of help with dealing with these Italian words, right? So most of this is pretty straightforward, but one thing that when I work on this song with my students, here on the second line, we have the word Cessa. Cessa. Now, if we were speaking this in English, we would pronounce that Cessa, maybe Kessa, but definitely Cessa does not come to mind. So this is a great place to get in here with your pencil and actually make a note. And what I would just do is, as close to it as possible, I would just write a big CH, something like that. That might remind me. Here it is again. It happens twice in this section. So I'm going to do it in both places because you know what? You would think most people are like, hey, I'll remember it the first time. And that's true sometimes, but then sometimes not so much, right? So it's just better just to mark it everywhere that it shows up. And so this is the two places on this page that it shows up. So the next thing, and this is the thing that I get after my students all the time about, this is my pet peeve, mark your breaths. Now, if you have a song that has a bunch of rests in it, that's really, really obvious where you're allowed to stop and breathe, you don't have to mark your breaths. You might want to circle those rests. But if we take a look here, I'm just going to kind of scroll through, and you can see here, there are a lot of places where there are not rests, but we're at phrase endings. So what are the rules for breathing? When you breathe, you could breathe at a punctuation mark. So here we have the end of a phrase. It has a period. So this would be a great place to take a breath, an obvious place to take a breath. So a lot of people do different things. I'm going to show you a couple different ways to mark your breaths. I would just suggest pick one and go with it. Some people like to use a check mark. So you could just put a big check mark right above there that says take a breath. And that's kind of one of the standards. Some people need a little bit more of a visual cue than that. So they'll put a big line. It doesn't matter. It's whatever works for you. And then finally, like say here in this line, in this middle line here, you are having a hard time getting from beginning of the line to the end of the line on one breath. Well, notice we have a little comma here. You could breathe in this spot. This might be a great place to do a little pickup breath. So you could write, and if you don't want to do a check mark, if you don't want to do the line, you could put a B there. It does not matter what you use as long as you know what you're talking about. In other words, I wouldn't suggest doing all three of these. Pick one and go with it and make it nice and consistent. When we get down here to the bottom of the page, we have a rest, and I would suggest circling it. One other thing you could do if you say get to this spot and you keep forgetting to take a big enough breath, like you're holding this, you see this as a half note and you're like, I have to hold this for 2 beats. You get a breath and come in, and then you end up coming in late because you're taking a breath. A little cheat that you can do here, and this is like kind of my throwback to choir days when we were all trying to get all our cutoffs lined up and our breaths lined up correctly. You can kind of cheat. So, yes, this is a half note, but also anybody that would be listening to you and judging your singing, like if you were doing this for a competition, they're all pretty smart in knowing that we have to breathe at some point, because you know what? Turning blue and falling over does not make for a good performance. So, one thing you can do is you could turn that into a quarter note. There we go. Sorry, the light was reflecting there. So you could turn that into a quarter note and put a little like squiggle there for a quarter note rest. So that's a little cheat that you can do for a breath as well. So another thing that you can do with your pencil is mark your dynamics. Now, as we look through this song, we have lots of dynamics. We start at a piano, we have a crescendo, we come here, we have a forte, we have like a little hairpin here, and then we decrescendo, and then we have a forte, a retard, and then look at this next centrist. It's super, super quiet. You might be fine with just looking at this and saying, hey, I got this. But oftentimes you're juggling a lot of balls at this point. You're trying to remember your entrance and you're trying to remember a whole bunch of things. Just like circle it. If you forget that you're coming in, if you're coming in too loud and don't have any place to go, circle it. If you're trying to remember that here I have to come in loudly and you're not coming in loud enough, circle it. So these are things that you can do, simple things, just circling things. And I know that sounds really, really basic, but it does help in your performance. Another thing that you can do, this is a great song, lots of things that we can look at. What if you're having a hard time finding your starting pitch here? If you look down on the piano, you don't necessarily have to read music to do this. This is an exercise in pattern matching, but if you can read music, this becomes a lot easier. So you can see this is a G, right? Second line up. Every good boy does fine. So this is your G. And when we start singing, the piano is playing the G. But guess what? This is too late to get a pitch because you're supposed to be making noise when the piano is playing that G. So where can I find my pitch in the preceding notes? And you have a G right here. And notice I'm marking it. I'm putting a big arrow there. And so I can listen for this note in the piano part right before I come in. Now, this is going to require a little bit of counting. This is not like the easiest note to hear because it's kind of in the middle of things. But now you've marked it. You can go back to your recording of your accompaniment or of your sing-along or whatever, and just really, really focus in on these 4 notes before you come in and find the G that you're supposed to come in on. And this will help give you a visual cue that this is where your starting pitch comes from. And you could do this just about anywhere. Now, the problem is what happens when you don't have your starting pitch fed to you. Well, that's going to be another video that I'll do another day to talk to you about intervals and how to figure stuff out that way. The other thing that you can do, say you don't know how to read music. So let's look at this tanto right here, this word here, in these 2 notes. If you don't read music at all and don't even know that you're going up, and I'm hoping that if you're singing this song, you at least know kind of the directionality of the line, but just say you don't, and say you are not remembering to slide up, have that little slide between these 2 notes, this little slur, you can draw an arrow. Remind yourself of that direction. And even I do this occasionally when it's like something's going fast and my brain is just not keeping up. I will sometimes actually draw a little bit of a direction just to remind myself, hey, we're going to move up now. Okay. But if you could do that. Now, if you do know your music theory, you would know that this is a perfect 4th. So now you could even write the interval above it. So instead of the arrow, you might write P4 above it to remind yourself that that's a perfect 4th. So it depends on how adept you are at your intervals and your music theory. But in the very least, you could use arrows to remind yourself what direction the line is moving in. All right, so we've just done a classical piece. Let's do something a little more modern. So this song has many, many verses in it. So we're just going to kind of look at 2 different verses. And so each verse is essentially the same. So this is one of those instances where you might want to do some riffing or something like that. So we're going to approach this slightly different than the last song. So the first thing, though, that you're going to want to do, if you have songs with turnbacks, in other words, you go and you sing to a certain point and then you have to turn back to a section to repeat it, it's often really good to mark where you're going. Make sure the roadmap is actually written in. Now, this piece is pretty straightforward because we're only looking at 2 pages. So here's the first page, and then if I turn the page, here's that first ending with the repeat. So what I tend to do with these, now some songs I have will take me back 3 or 4 pages, so this becomes super important when I have something like that. But I tend to write in measure numbers. So you might have noticed that with the last song that I had the measure numbers written in. In this case, when I printed this out, the program that I used puts the measure numbers in if I ask it to. So it saves me a little bit of writing. But this helps me not only communicate to whoever I'm working with, hey, I'm in bar 16, can we go over that or whatever? It also helps me with turnbacks. So that first ending repeats back here to measure 16. Okay, so when I come here to that first ending, since it's only going back 1 page, I'm not sure that I care to write the page number, but I will, just for the sake of this example, I would write page 3, measure 16. And that reminds me that the repeat goes back to that spot. 2 different verses, and you can see here that the words are a little different. So you can see that there's some slightly different rhythms happening here. And there are some places where in one verse it makes sense to take a breath, and in the next verse it may not make sense to take a breath. Okay, so you're gonna have to kind of work that sort of thing out. Like, can I do this whole line on one breath? After Taylor, there is a comma that says to me I can take a breath. So after the first verse, so I'm going to be right small now. Instead of doing stuff up above here, since it looks like in the second verse I may not want to take a breath, I'm going to put like a little check mark right at the end of that. Now, in the second verse, there's no punctuation. So here's the thing. You may need to still take a breath if there's no punctuation, but say that you're like, hey, you know what? I can do that, but I need a reminder because my gut tells me I should breathe here because I kind of breathed in the same spot up above. So now you're going to draw a little line that kind of connects things. And if you still are taking a breath and you really don't want to take a breath there, you could even write NB for no breath. So for when you have multiple verses on a page, instead of writing everything really big above the staff, you might have to write a little smaller and kind of get in there between the words in each verse to mark your breaths. And dynamics if there are dynamics. So this is a particular song that has, it's a bluesy song, so you can riff on it if you want. Maybe I decide that the top verse, I'm just going to sing it as written. That's fine. However, down here, maybe I'm going to do suitcase and a trunk, and I'm going to do a little bit of slide up to the end. And I still might take a breath there, but I want to just like just move right on up there, right? So I might do a little note to indicate that I'm going to do a slide. Now you're going to have to mark this the way that makes sense to you. But if I was going to mark it in my music, I would actually do this up on the staff just because I'm going to need some space. And I'm going to do like a squiggly line like that, to kind of indicate that I'm going to do just like a little bit of a riff or something or a slide to go on up. And if I'm going to do this for one verse, I'll write second verse and put an arrow to it. So that's one way you could do it. Down here, I've already written this in, but you can see that I have some little teeny weeny notes written above what's there. So this reminds me that when I'm on the second verse. So again, this is going to be a second verse thing. And if I'm having a hard time remembering that, I'll do that again and put a little arrow there. But those little notes are going to be kind of my alternative. So some people are really, really good at just kind of riffing off the cuff and they can make something that sounds good. And some people need some guidance. I happen to be one of those people who, once I have kind of a game plan in mind, I'm happy riffing, but I do need to give myself some structure. So I mark my music to give myself structure. I hope you found this useful. I know that there's probably a million other things that you could be doing to mark your music, but the point of this exercise is to just show you that your music is actually meant to be written in, and that the lowly pencil is going to be a huge help to you as you learn your music and as you bring your music from just the notes on the page into a full performance. If you're looking for more help while you're learning your music or want to take your singing skills to the next level, please visit my website and book a discovery call with me today.